The first supe died on live television, without anyone understanding how. Cameras caught Homelander hovering above Times Square, eyes glowing, promising order after another riot. Then, without warning, he turned mid-sentence and burned Queen Maeve through the chest. She didn't even raise her guard. She looked confused, like she was reacting to something no one else could see. The crowd screamed. Homelander froze in the air. He stared at his own hands like they belonged to a stranger and kept repeating that he never fired. Vought's live feeds immediately contradicted each other. One showed Maeve attacking first. Another showed Homelander alone. Raw street footage had people arguing over what they had just witnessed while staring at the same screen. Within hours, witnesses rewrote their own statements. Police reports conflicted with bodycam recordings. News anchors read teleprompters they didn't remember writing. And somewhere in the city, a calm man watched quietly, knowing no one on Earth could now trust what they saw ever again. This wasn't the incident. This was the first crack in reality itself. What follows isn't a battle. It's the collapse of certainty, where heroes, corporations, and governments lose the ability to confirm what is real. Subscribe once, because what happens next won't make sense unless you witness every step of the unraveling. Times Square did not calm down after the broadcast. It became louder, angrier, and far more dangerous because nobody agreed on what had happened. Some swore Homelander snapped. Others claimed Queen Maeve attacked him first. Thousands of phones held recordings that proved both stories and neither at the same time. People replayed the footage over and over, watching details shift between viewings like the event was rewriting itself. Vought's emergency servers were overwhelmed within minutes. Every internal feed from the scene showed different angles, different sequences, different aggressors. Analysts argued over which recording was real, while executives demanded answers that no one could provide. The word tampering was thrown around until it lost meaning, because the inconsistencies were too precise to be hacking and too impossible to be real. Inside Vought Tower, the air felt heavier than usual. Not because of panic, but because something fundamental had broken. Their entire empire was built on controlling narrative, editing perception, shaping truth into something profitable. Now, reality itself had slipped outside their grasp, and they had no way to contain it. Homelander sat alone in a reinforced conference room, staring at a screen playing the footage on repeat. He watched himself turn. He watched the beam leave his eyes. He watched Maeve fall. And every time he whispered that he never did it. The more he watched, the less certain he became of what his own memory told him. His breathing grew shallow, and for the first time in years, he looked afraid of himself. Across the city, Billy Butcher leaned over a laptop in a dim safehouse, eyes narrowed at the same clips. He didn't care about Vaught's version or the public's version. He cared about patterns, and the pattern here was wrong. This wasn't corruption or cover-up. This was something that made logic itself unreliable. The event didn't feel staged. It felt displaced. Butcher muttered that this wasn't a supe problem. This was something worse. Because supes left evidence, this left contradictions. The first reports of the man in white came from people who couldn't agree on where they saw him. A bystander swore he stood calmly near a hot dog stand during the chaos. Another insisted he was walking through the panicked crowd without reacting to anything. A third claimed he had been standing on a rooftop across the street, watching. None of them could describe his face clearly, but they all remembered the same unsettling detail. He didn't look like he belonged to the panic. He looked like someone observing an experiment. By the time Vaught's internal security flagged these reports, something else had already gone wrong. Facial recognition cameras pulled no matches for the man, not because he wasn't there, but because the system kept returning different faces for the same position in the footage. It was as if the cameras themselves couldn't decide who they had recorded. That was when Vought stopped calling it interference. They began calling it a phenomenon. In a quiet hotel room several blocks away, Sosuke Aizen stood by the window, looking down at the city like it was a slow-moving puzzle. He did not rush. He did not show interest in the sirens or the helicopters. His gaze was calm, analytical, and faintly disappointed. This world had built an empire out of lies, and yet its people still believed sight was a reliable sense. He had already corrected that mistake. Kyoka Suitsu had been released hours earlier. No one remembered when they first saw the blade. That was the elegance of it. At some point during the chaos, during the confusion, during the riot before Homelander's speech, countless people had caught a brief glimpse of a sword they didn't think mattered. And now their perception belonged to him. Aizen didn't view this as an attack. This was calibration. Back in Vought Tower, executives held a closed-door emergency meeting that quickly devolved into accusations. Someone suggested Homelander had suffered a mental break. Someone else argued that Maeve's death had been staged for political leverage. A third executive slammed a report on the table showing eyewitness statements that contradicted themselves within the same paragraph. They weren't dealing with misinformation. They were dealing with reality, behaving incorrectly. And for the first time, Vought's greatest strength, control of perception, had become useless. Because perception was no longer theirs to control. Homelander suddenly stood up from his chair, breathing faster. He pointed at the screen and demanded they rewind to a specific moment. The footage complied. He leaned closer, squinting. In the reflection of a storefront window behind him, there was reduced clarity. A faint figure, barely noticeable. A man standing still, while everything burned around him. Homelander swore he remembered that man being somewhere else. Then he swore he had never seen him before. Then he swore the man wasn't there at all. The room fell silent. For the first time, Homelander didn't trust what he was seeing. Butcher, meanwhile, was already moving. He didn't know who the man was, but he knew this. Every report that mentioned him came from someone who sounded deeply unsettled, like they were describing a memory that didn't belong to them. That was enough for Butcher to start asking the right questions. He didn't hunt sups anymore. He hunted inconsistencies. And this was the biggest one he had ever seen. That night, Vought sent a discreet tactical team to sweep the area around Times Square for the unidentified observer. They found nothing. Or rather, they found reports from each team member claiming they had searched different streets, despite GPS proving they had never left the same intersection. Arguments broke out over who had gone where. Accusations of incompetence turned into shouting matches. The mission collapsed without a single shot fired. The next morning, news outlets across the country ran with wildly different headlines. Some reported Homelander's breakdown. Others reported Maeve's betrayal. A few ran stories about a mysterious civilian who had been present at every key moment. No two broadcasts agreed, and none of them realized they were contradicting each other live on air. The public began arguing not about what happened, but about what reality itself had shown them. And in that confusion, Aizen walked through Manhattan streets in plain sight. People moved around him without noticing him, not because he was invisible, but because their minds had already accepted him as something unimportant. He passed by police officers, journalists, and panicked civilians, each of whom briefly glanced at him without understanding why they had. He wasn't hiding. He had simply removed himself from significance. By the time Vought finally issued an internal order to identify and detain the unknown man, something irreversible had already occurred. Their analysts could no longer verify which reports were accurate. Their security could no longer trust surveillance footage. And Homelander could no longer trust his own memory. The system Vought had spent decades perfecting had begun collapsing, not from attack, but from uncertainty. And as Aizen quietly observed the city adapting to its new condition, he understood something with quiet satisfaction. This world did not need to be conquered. It only needed to doubt itself. That night, Homelander refused to sleep, replaying the footage until his eyes burned. But at some point, he realized something that made his hands tremble. In every version of the recording, the man in white was closer to him than he remembered, as if he had been standing beside Homelander the entire time. Homelander did not attend Maeve's memorial. Vought staged it anyway, filling the cathedral with cameras, grieving civilians, and carefully selected supes who could cry on cue. The broadcast focused on loss, heroism, and sacrifice, avoiding any mention of the contradictions still tearing through internal reports. To the public, this was closure. To Homelander, it felt like a performance built on quicksand. He watched from a private room high in Vought Tower, arms crossed, jaw tight. Every time the cameras panned across the crowd, he searched for the man in white. He didn't know why. He couldn't even remember clearly what the man looked like. But a quiet instinct kept telling him that someone had been present during the incident who did not belong there. And the more he tried to remember, the more the memory slipped away. Down below, executives whispered about narrative control. They debated how to reframe the Times Square disaster into something manageable. Some wanted to blame a rogue supe. Others pushed the idea of foreign sabotage. None of them addressed the core problem, because none of them could articulate it without sounding insane. They were no longer certain what had truly happened. Meanwhile, Billy Butcher was already moving through Manhattan with Frenchie and Mother's Milk, interviewing witnesses who had been near the square. Every conversation followed the same pattern. People confidently described the event, then stopped mid-sentence and corrected themselves. Details shifted, timelines rearranged. A woman swore she saw Homelander fire first, then seconds later insisted Maeve attacked him. When Butcher showed her her own phone recording, she stared at it like it was fake. Butcher didn't argue. He just listened, collecting contradictions like evidence. By evening, he had filled pages of notes that made no logical sense. And for the first time, he considered that they weren't dealing with lies or manipulation. They were dealing with something that changed what people believed they had seen after the fact. Something was rewriting perception. At sunset, Homelander finally left the tower. He told no one where he was going. He just needed air, needed distance from the screens, the accusations, the whispers. He flew low over the city, scanning streets below, searching for something he couldn't define. That was when he saw him. A man walking calmly through a crowded sidewalk, hands behind his back, looking up at the skyline like a tourist. White clothing, brown hair, relaxed posture, completely ordinary in the middle of chaos. Homelander landed hard enough to crack the pavement. People screamed and scattered, phones rising to record. The man did not react. He simply stopped walking and turned slowly, as if he had been expecting this interruption. Homelander stepped closer, eyes glowing faintly. He demanded the man's name, his affiliation, why he had been in Times Square. The man listened politely, head slightly tilted, like he was being asked a mildly interesting question rather than confronted by the most powerful supe on Earth. Then he answered calmly, "My name is Sosuke Aizen." The name meant nothing to Homelander. What mattered was the tone. No fear, no urgency, no recognition of danger. It irritated him instantly. He circled Aizen slowly, trying to read his heartbeat, his breathing, his scent. Everything was steady. Homelander accused him of interfering in the incident. Aizen simply asked which version of the incident Homelander believed had occurred. The question landed harder than any insult. Homelander opened his mouth to respond and realized he wasn't sure anymore. His eyes flickered. Aizen continued speaking in the same calm voice, explaining that confusion was natural when one relied too heavily on sight. He spoke like a teacher correcting a student's misunderstanding, not mocking, not threatening, just certain. Homelander felt something unfamiliar. Disorientation. He stepped back and fired his heat vision without warning. The beam tore through the street, cars, and storefronts behind Aizen, carving a molten trench across the block. Civilians screamed and ran. Smoke filled the air. Aizen was standing to Homelander's left, completely unharmed. Homelander spun, eyes wide. He had been looking directly at him. He was sure of it. He fired again. The beam struck a traffic light instead. Sparks rained down. Aizen's voice came from behind him now, calmly asking why Homelander kept attacking empty space. For the first time in years, Homelander felt genuine panic. He launched himself into the air, trying to gain perspective from above. From that height, he scanned the street, searching for the white figure. He found him easily, standing in the middle of the road. Then when Homelander blinked, the figure was on a rooftop. Then in the crowd. Then nowhere. Below, civilians recorded everything. But when they replayed the footage seconds later, the recordings showed Homelander blasting random parts of the street while screaming at nothing. There was no man in white visible on any device. Vought's monitoring team watched in horror from the tower. They saw Homelander attacking empty air, shouting at an invisible opponent. Analysts checked every angle, every camera, every drone feed. None of them captured Aizen. Yet witness calls were flooding in about a calm man speaking to Homelander in the middle of the destruction. Reality was splitting again. Back on the ground, Aizen spoke gently, almost kindly. He explained that Homelander's strength was extraordinary, but it relied entirely on senses that could not be trusted. He mentioned something called Kyoka Suijutsu in passing, like a footnote Homelander should already understand. Homelander lunged forward to grab him. His hands closed around a mailbox. The metal crumpled in his grip as he roared in frustration. Aizen was suddenly standing several steps away, watching with mild curiosity, as if observing an animal reacting to a mirror. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move quickly. He simply let Homelander exhaust himself attacking illusions that felt perfectly real. The more Homelander tried to assert control, the less control he had. Eventually, he stopped. He hovered above the street, breathing hard, eyes darting wildly. Aizen looked up at him with the same calm expression and said something that would echo in Homelander's mind for days. "You are not fighting me. You are fighting what you believe is happening." Then Aizen turned and walked away. Homelander didn't chase him, because he no longer trusted which direction Aizen had gone. By the time Vought's rapid response team arrived, Homelander was standing alone in the destroyed street, surrounded by cameras and terrified civilians. He told them the man had been right there. He pointed. He described him in detail. The team checked their footage. There was no one there. That night, Homelander sat in darkness, replaying the encounter in his mind. He tried to remember when he first saw the man's face clearly. He couldn't. He tried to remember when the confusion began. He couldn't. He realized, slowly and painfully, that he might have been under this influence long before Times Square. And that thought terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Across the city, Billy Butcher watched clips of the confrontation that were already going viral. He didn't focus on what was visible. He focused on what Homelander was reacting to. And for the first time, Butcher realized this wasn't about a supe with strength. This was about someone who could make the strongest supe in the world look insane without touching him. Somewhere in Manhattan, Aizen observed the growing chaos with quiet satisfaction. He had not attacked Homelander. He had simply allowed Homelander to experience the consequences of unreliable perception. and the result was far more destructive than any physical battle. By midnight, Vought issued an internal directive. Find Sosuke Aizen. They didn't yet understand that the moment they gave him a name, they had already lost the ability to track him. Morning inside Vought Tower did not begin with damage control. It began with arguments over whether the previous night had happened the way anyone remembered it. Security teams presented footage of Homelander destroying half a street while shouting at nothing. Field agents insisted there had been a man present, calmly speaking to him. Analysts overlaid every available camera angle and found no consistent version of events. The meeting stopped being about Homelander's behavior. It became about the reliability of their own evidence. Ashley Barrett demanded someone explain why dozens of eyewitnesses described the same unidentified man, yet no camera had captured him. The tech department blamed corruption. The cyber team blamed interference. The legal department quietly asked if this was something that could be blamed on a foreign power. No one dared say the obvious, that reality itself was no longer aligning with their recordings. They finally pulled up the name that had surfaced repeatedly in field notes. Sosuke Aizen. No corporate history, no medical record, no immigration trail, no birth certificate. It was as if the name had appeared fully formed inside their system without ever being entered. The more they searched, the more contradictions surfaced, as if their own databases disagreed with themselves. Some files showed a passport. Others showed nothing. Meanwhile, Billy Butcher had reached the same name through completely different means. Witnesses didn't agree on where they saw the man, but they all remembered hearing someone call him Aizen during Homelander's breakdown. Butcher wrote it down without knowing why it mattered. It was just another thread in a tapestry of nonsense that refused to behave logically. But Butcher trusted nonsense, because nonsense meant someone was playing a deeper game. Back in Vought, they made a decision that had worked for decades. They sent the Deep. Not because he was competent, but because he was disposable. If this was some kind of supe illusionist or mind manipulator, sending a high-value asset first would be foolish. The Deep was told to quietly locate Aizen, engage him in conversation, and report back. Simple, low-risk, contained. The Deep found Aizen sitting on a park bench by the Hudson River before noon. He didn't know how he found him. One moment he was walking aimlessly with a description in his head, and the next he was looking directly at a calm man in white staring out over the water. It felt less like a search and more like he had been guided there without realizing it. He approached with forced confidence. Aizen greeted him politely, as if they had scheduled this meeting. The Deep began asking questions he had rehearsed: name, affiliation, powers, intentions. Aizen answered each one with soft clarity, never refusing, never hesitating. The Deep felt strangely at ease, like he was talking to someone who understood him better than his own teammates did. After 10 minutes, the Deep thanked him and walked away. He returned to Vought Tower with a full report. Except when he began speaking, the words didn't make sense. He described meeting a woman by the river, then corrected himself to say it was a man, then insisted he had spoken to no one at all. His bodycam footage showed him sitting alone on the bench, talking to empty air for 10 minutes. The room went silent. This wasn't like Homelander. This was quieter, more precise. The Deep wasn't panicked. He was confused in a way that frightened everyone watching. He genuinely believed he had gathered information, but his memory and the recording did not match in any way that could be explained. Ashley ordered a psychological evaluation immediately. But privately, she began to realize something worse. This wasn't a power that attacked the body. It attacked the consistency of experience. At the same time, Butcher finally got his hands on security footage from the park through one of his contacts. He watched the Deep sit alone on a bench, nodding occasionally, smiling like he was in conversation. Butcher didn't laugh. He leaned closer. The Deep's eye movements weren't random. They were tracking someone who simply wasn't visible in the footage. Butcher whispered to himself. "He's there, we just can't see him." That conclusion terrified him more than anything. Because if someone could exist inside perception without existing on record, there was no conventional way to hunt them. Back at Vought, a new term began circulating in hushed voices. Perceptual anomaly. Not illusion, not invisibility, something more invasive, something that changed what people believed they had witnessed even after it happened. Analysts noticed that anyone who had direct interaction with Aizen reported contradictions in memory afterward. And the realization slowly formed. This wasn't affecting cameras. It was affecting minds. By late afternoon, Homelander stormed into the executive floor unannounced. He demanded updates, demanded to know if they had found the man. His eyes moved constantly, scanning corners, reflections, windows. He looked like someone expecting an ambush from reality itself. When they showed him the Deep's footage, something inside him snapped. He wasn't angry. He was vindicated. He pointed at the screen and said, "That's exactly what happened to me." For the first time, Vought executives understood that Homelander wasn't unstable. He was experiencing the same phenomenon as everyone else, just more violently. And that made it worse. Because Homelander's instability had always been manageable through narrative and control. This wasn't something they could spin. This was something that made their most powerful asset doubt his own senses. As evening fell, Aizen walked through downtown Manhattan again, unnoticed and unhurried. He observed police attempting to organize witness statements that refused to align. He watched reporters argue on live television about footage that contradicted itself between replays. He saw a world desperately trying to hold onto objective truth while it slipped through their fingers. He did not interfere. He didn't need to. Kyoka Suijitsu had already done the work. This world had built its power on spectacle, image, and perception. Vought's empire depended on controlling what people believed they saw. Aizen simply removed the reliability of sight, and the entire structure began collapsing under its own weight. That night, Vought escalated. They authorized a full surveillance sweep of Manhattan, deploying drones, satellites, and facial recognition in overlapping grids designed to track any anomaly. They believed more data would fix the problem. Instead, it multiplied it. Different drones reported Aizen in different locations at the same time. Satellites marked conflicting positions. The system began flagging its own data as corrupted because nothing matched. Their solution had become another layer of contradiction. And for the first time in Vought's history, their technology was useless. In a quiet apartment overlooking the city, Aizen stood by a window and watched lights flicker across rooftops as drones searched for him. He had not moved, but to them he was everywhere. He understood something they didn't yet grasp. They believed they were hunting a person. They were actually trying to hunt the absence of certainty. And that was impossible. The first riot did not start because of anger. It started because two groups of people stood on the same street corner, replaying the same video, and realized they were not seeing the same thing. One group swore Homelander had defended himself. The other swore he had murdered Maeve without provocation. Neither side could prove the other wrong, because every replay seemed to shift details in subtle, maddening ways. Voices rose, accusations turned personal. Someone threw a bottle. Someone else swung back. Within minutes, police sirens filled the block as people fought over what they believed reality had shown them. This pattern spread across Manhattan. Arguments in coffee shops, fights in subway stations, news panels dissolving into shouting matches on live television. People were no longer debating opinions. They were defending what they thought their own eyes had witnessed and discovering that others' memories contradicted theirs completely. Certainty was becoming a trigger. Vought watched the unrest escalate with growing dread. They issued statements urging calm, promising transparent investigations, but the public had already lost faith in official explanations. If footage couldn't be trusted, if eyewitnesses contradicted themselves, then Vought's words meant nothing. Their usual tools, public relations, narrative shaping, media influence, felt powerless against a problem that existed inside perception itself. Ashley began to realize the scope of the damage. This wasn't a scandal. This was societal destabilization. Homelander, meanwhile, stopped appearing in public entirely. He stayed inside the tower, packing rooms like a trapped animal, checking reflections, watching shadows. He began covering mirrors. He no longer trusted what he saw in glass or screens. Every surface felt like it might hide the man in white, standing just out of sight. His paranoia was no longer emotional. It was rational. Billy Butcher saw the riots on television and understood something faster than anyone else. This wasn't random chaos. It was a symptom. People were reacting to the same disease Homelander had shown signs of unreliable perception. Butcher didn't care about the riots themselves. He cared about the cause spreading outward like a virus. And viruses had sources. He told Frenchie and Mother's Milk that they weren't hunting a supe. They were hunting a man who had turned the city into a place where evidence meant nothing. That night, Aizen walked through the Lower East Side as police tried to disperse another crowd. He passed by officers shouting orders, by civilians screaming at each other over phones, by journalists trying desperately to report facts that no longer stayed consistent. No one stopped him. No one noticed him. He moved through the unrest like a calm current through turbulent water. He observed without judgment. This was not destruction. This was a system unraveling under the weight of doubt. Vought attempted something drastic. They called in multiple supes at once to sweep different parts of the city, hoping their heightened senses could detect what cameras could not. A train, Starlight, and Black Noir were deployed with overlapping patrol routes, instructed to report anything unusual. Within an hour, their reports conflicted beyond usefulness. A train claimed he saw a man standing calmly in the middle of a blocked street, watching the riot. Starlight insisted there was no one there when she arrived seconds later. Black Noir returned without speaking, his helmet cam showing him walking in circles around an empty alley as if following someone invisible. The pattern was undeniable now. Direct exposure to this man did not produce information. It produced contradictions. Starlight was the first to say it out loud. This isn't a power we understand. And for once, no one argued. Homelander watched the reports come in and felt something close to relief. It wasn't just him. Others were experiencing it too. That meant he wasn't losing his mind. It meant there was an external cause, but that realization came with a worse implication. If this could affect everyone, then no one was safe from it. In a quiet observation deck high above the city, Aizen paused to look down at the scattered fires and flashing sirens. He did not see chaos. He saw confirmation. This world had placed absolute faith in what could be recorded, broadcast, and replayed. They believed truth lived in footage, in angles, in evidence. By removing the reliability of perception, he had turned their greatest strength into their greatest vulnerability. And he had done it without raising his voice once. Butcher finally tracked down a bartender who had been near Times Square during the original incident. The man spoke carefully, like he was afraid of his own memory. He described seeing a calm stranger standing still while everyone panicked. He described feeling strangely reassured by his presence, even as chaos unfolded. Then he admitted he couldn't remember the man's face at all. But he remembered the feeling. Butcher wrote that down. Because feelings, unlike images, weren't shifting. Back in Vought Tower, a new directive was issued. They would stop trying to track Aizen visually. Instead, they would map his presence through behavioral anomalies. Anywhere reports contradicted themselves too heavily, they would assume he had been nearby. It was the first strategy that acknowledged what they were really dealing with. Not a man. A distortion. As midnight approached, emergency services across Manhattan reported something new. People were calling 911 claiming they had seen individuals vanish mid-conversation. When officers arrived, they found the callers standing alone, confused, insisting someone had been right in front of them seconds earlier. Security cameras showed no one else present. The phenomenon was spreading. Not because Aizen was actively doing anything, but because more people were falling under Kyoka Suigetsu's influence without realizing it. A glimpse here, a passing reflection there, each exposure quietly adding another mind to the web of unreliable perception. The city wasn't breaking from violence. It was breaking from uncertainty. And in a world built on spectacle, uncertainty was more destructive than any explosion. Aizen stood on a rooftop overlooking the skyline, hands behind his back, watching helicopters sweep searchlights across buildings in futile patterns. He understood something Vought had not yet accepted. They believed this was escalating. To him, this was still the beginning. Because the true damage would not come from riots or panic. It would come when institutions, law enforcement, media, government, realized they could no longer confirm what was real. And that realization was only hours away. By dawn, the problem had outgrown Vought. What had started as a corporate crisis had become a federal one. The Department of Defense requested a full briefing after multiple law enforcement agencies reported identical anomalies, contradictory witness accounts, unreliable footage, and officers insisting they had spoken to people who did not appear on body cams. The word hallucination appeared in early drafts of reports, then was quietly removed when too many unrelated departments used it at the same time. This was no longer dismissed as urban panic. It was classified as a national security concern. Vought executives found themselves sitting across from generals and intelligence officials who did not care about public image. They wanted explanations, causes, and solutions. Ashley tried to explain the concept of a perceptual anomaly without sounding insane, but the room's skepticism faded quickly when military surveillance from the previous night showed the same contradictions Vought had seen. Drones had tracked a man walking across 3 boroughs simultaneously. Satellites marked heat signatures that appeared and vanished in seconds. No one in the room laughed, because the data was too consistent in its inconsistency. Homelander was asked to attend the meeting. He refused at first, then arrived unannounced halfway through, eyes restless, movements sharp. He did not sit. He listened as officers described what they believed was happening to the city. For once, he did not interrupt or boast. He simply asked one question. "Have any of you seen him clearly?" No one answered. That silence confirmed his fear more than any footage ever had. Billy Butcher, on the other hand, saw the military involvement as an opportunity. He knew that once the government stepped in, information would start flowing through channels Vought could not fully control. He contacted an old CIA source and asked a simple question. What happens when the Pentagon admits they can't trust their own surveillance? The answer came back blunt. They assume they're under attack. By midday, National Guard units were positioned around Manhattan under the pretense of riot control. But their real purpose was observation. Soldiers were given instructions to record everything, report everything, and trust nothing without cross-confirmation. They were trained for urban combat, not for questioning whether the person standing in front of them actually existed. The first patrol to report direct contact with Aizen did so calmly. Two soldiers claimed they had seen a man walking down an empty street, hands behind his back, looking up at the skyline. They approached, asked for identification, and spoke with him for several minutes. He was polite, cooperative, unthreatening. When they returned to their squad leader, their helmet cams showed them standing alone in the street, talking to no one. The soldiers did not panic. They grew quiet in a way that frightened their commanding officer. Because they insisted, the conversation had happened. Within an hour, 3 more patrols reported similar encounters. Different street, same description, same result. The military realized something Vought had already learned. Direct engagement did not produce evidence. It produced doubt. In Vought Tower, analysts overlaid military reports onto their anomaly map of Manhattan. The pattern was clear now. The more people searched for Aizen, the more contradictory encounters were reported. His presence was like a gravitational field, bending perception around him, and the act of trying to observe him only made the distortion worse. They were feeding the phenomenon by chasing it. Aizen watched a convoy of military vehicles roll through an avenue below his vantage point. He did not feel threatened. He felt validated. This world believed that escalation meant force, numbers, technology. They responded to uncertainty by adding more observers, not realizing that each observer became another mind influenced by Kyoka Suijitsu. They were multiplying their own vulnerability. Homelander finally left Vought Tower again, ignoring orders to stay put. He flew across the city, scanning streets filled with armed soldiers and flashing lights. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like the most powerful presence in the sky. He felt like part of a larger confusion he could not dominate. Then he saw Aizen again, standing on the roof of a parking structure, calmly watching the military convoy below. Homelander landed in front of him without a word. This time he didn't attack. He didn't shout. He just stared, trying to anchor the image of Aizen in his mind. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment would slip away if he moved too fast. Aizen greeted him like an old acquaintance. Homelander asked how to stop this. Aizen answered with unsettling simplicity. Stop relying on what you see. The answer enraged Homelander because it felt like mockery and truth at the same time. He tried to memorize Aizen's face, every detail, every feature. But the longer he stared, the less confident he became that he was remembering it correctly. Aizen explained that the world below was not falling apart because of violence. It was falling apart because certainty had been removed. Homelander realized something horrifying in that moment. Aizen had not attacked the city. He had attacked the concept of reliable reality. Before Homelander could respond, shouts rose from the street below. Soldiers were pointing upward, arguing over whether someone was standing on the rooftop. Some saw 2 figures. Others saw only Homelander. A few insisted the roof was empty. Their confusion was visible even from above. Homelander looked back at Aizen. For a split second, he couldn't tell if he was still there. When he blinked, Aizen was gone. The military escalated again that night. They deployed thermal imaging, motion sensors, and overlapping visual grids, attempting to create a system where no single perspective could dominate. They believed redundancy would solve the problem. Instead, the data feeds contradicted each other so severely that analysts couldn't compile a coherent picture of the city. They had built a system designed to detect threats. Now it only detected uncertainty. Billy Butcher watched the news coverage and finally understood the scale. This wasn't just about SUPs anymore. This was about institutions losing the ability to confirm reality. And once that happened, control, real control, disappeared. Somewhere above the city, Aizen observed the spread of armed forces with quiet interest. He had not used force. He had not issued threats. And yet, the world was mobilizing as if under invasion. He understood something they did not. They were not entering a war against him. They were entering a war against their own senses. And that was a war they could never win. The first report from outside the United States came from London. A news crew covering the unrest in Manhattan replayed Vought's conflicting footage on air, arguing about what had happened. During the segment, the anchor paused mid-sentence and asked her co-host if there had always been a man standing behind Homelander in the clip. The co-host said no. The producer said yes. The recording, when reviewed minutes later, showed no one. The argument continued off-camera. But the unease remained. Within hours, similar incidents appeared in Paris, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo. People watching the Times Square footage began reporting details that did not exist in the recordings. Arguments broke out in studios, homes, and online forums. The phenomenon was no longer tied to physical presence. It was spreading through observation. Governments began contacting Vought directly, demanding answers. They wanted to know if this was a supe weapon, a psychological agent, or a broadcast anomaly. Vought had no explanation to offer that did not sound like paranoia. They shared data, reports, contradictions, and hoped someone else could make sense of it. Instead, other nations reported the same symptoms. People who had never set foot in Manhattan were now questioning what they had seen. Billy Butcher watched this development with a cold realization. Whatever this man had done, it wasn't confined to proximity anymore. The moment someone saw the footage, even through a screen, they began experiencing the same perceptual instability. Butcher didn't understand how, but he understood the consequence. This wasn't local. It was infectious. In Vought Tower, panic shifted into something more controlled and far more dangerous. They stopped trying to contain the situation internally. They began coordinating with federal agencies, international intelligence, and military advisors, not because they wanted help, but because they could no longer pretend they had control. Ashley listened as experts used words like mimetic hazard and perceptual contamination. None of those terms made her feel better. Homelander watched the global reports from a dark room, eyes unfocused. He saw anchors across the world arguing over invisible details. He saw governments holding emergency meetings over a single video clip. He realized slowly that this man had done something he had never imagined possible. He had made the entire planet question what they were seeing at the same time. And Homelander understood the horror of that more than anyone. Aizen stood on a pedestrian bridge over the East River, watching boats drift silently beneath him. He did not need to travel. Kyoka Suijitsu did not require his physical presence once someone had seen it. A glimpse, a reflection, a moment of visual contact was enough. The Times Square incident had been broadcast worldwide before Vought realized what was happening. Millions had unknowingly fallen under the blade's influence. Aizen did not consider this an attack. He considered it an introduction. Governments attempted to counter the spread by issuing advisories. They warned citizens not to rewatch the footage, not to trust unverified recordings, not to speculate publicly. But the warnings only made people more curious. The clip spread faster. Discussions intensified. The very act of trying to suppress it amplified exposure. The world was participating willingly. Military analysts across several countries came to the same grim conclusion. This was not a weapon they could neutralize. It was a condition they had already been exposed to. Back in Manhattan, Butcher realized something else. People who had never seen the original event directly were starting to describe the man in white with unsettling familiarity. They spoke as if they had seen him personally, even though they had only watched a recording that did not visibly contain him. Butcher understood then. This man didn't need to be seen clearly. He only needed to be glimpsed once. And that glimpse could come from anywhere. Inside Vought, a final desperate measure was proposed. They would shut down all broadcasts of the incident worldwide, scrub it from the internet, erase every copy they could find. It was too late, but they needed to feel like they were doing something. Within minutes of the takedown effort, more copies appeared online than before. And each one spread the influence further. Aizen watched the skyline as night fell, lights flickering across buildings like a restless heartbeat. He understood the pattern unfolding with quiet satisfaction. This world believed perception was passive, that seeing was something that happened to them. They did not understand that perception could be claimed, redirected, owned. And now it belonged to him. Homelander stepped out onto a balcony high above the city, staring at the horizon. He tried to imagine a place far away from Manhattan, far from Vought, far from the footage. But the reports told him there was no distance anymore. People across oceans were experiencing the same uncertainty he was. For the first time in his life, Homelander felt small. Not because someone was stronger than him, but because someone had made strength irrelevant. Billy Butcher looked at the global news and muttered something that sounded almost like admiration. "This bloke didn't break the city," he said. "He broke the bloody world." And somewhere in the quiet between sirens and broadcasts, Aizen understood that the next phase had already begun. Because once governments realized they could not trust what their people were seeing, they would do the only thing they knew how to do. They would prepare for war. Not against him, but against a reality they could no longer verify. The first coordinated response did not involve weapons. It involved isolation. Governments across multiple countries issued quiet internal directives to reduce visual exposure to anything connected to the Times Square incident. Intelligence agencies ordered analysts to rely on audio reports instead of video. Military units were instructed to operate in pairs, cross-checking what each person claimed to see before acting. They believed limiting perception would limit the spread. Instead, it revealed how deeply the problem had already taken root. Soldiers began reporting disagreements over things as simple as street layouts during patrols. Analysts argued over maps that had not changed. Two officers in the same room would describe different positions for the same object, both convinced they were correct. The world wasn't containing the phenomenon. It was discovering it had already been absorbed. Inside Vought, Starlight became the first supe to openly question whether this could be fought at all. She reviewed hours of footage, trying to find consistency. Instead, she noticed something subtle and terrifying. The more she watched, the more uncertain she became about what she had seen earlier. Details she thought she remembered clearly began to blur. She shut the screens off and sat in silence. Because for the first time, she was afraid that continuing to look would make it worse. Billy Butcher came to a similar conclusion from the opposite direction. He stopped watching footage entirely. He relied only on conversations, emotions, patterns in behavior. He told Frenchie and Mother's Milk that eyes were useless now. They had to track this man by how the world reacted around him, not by trying to spot him directly. They weren't hunting a person. They were hunting disturbances in certainty. Homelander, meanwhile, began testing himself. He flew to isolated parts of the city, staring at objects and trying to memorize them perfectly. A lamppost, a parked car, a storefront sign. He would close his eyes, then open them, checking if anything had shifted. Sometimes it had. Or at least he thought it had. And the doubt alone was enough to make him furious. That night, Aizen sat quietly in a public library, reading. People walked past him without noticing. A librarian briefly glanced at him, then forgot why she had looked in that direction. He turned pages calmly, as if the city were not unraveling outside. He did not need to act. The world was trying to resist something it did not understand, and that resistance was exposing the depth of its vulnerability. He observed the pattern with interest. The more people tried to verify reality, the more they realized verification itself had become unreliable. Vought attempted a psychological countermeasure. They brought in experts to train supes and staff in grounding techniques, methods to rely on touch, sound, and logic instead of sight. The idea was simple. If vision was compromised, other senses could compensate. The results were disastrous. People began arguing over sounds they claimed to hear that others did not. Objects touched moments ago were described differently seconds later. The training didn't stabilize perception. It spread the doubt into every sense. Starlight attended one of these sessions and left halfway through. She realized something no one else had said yet. This wasn't a sensory problem. It was a control problem. Someone else was deciding what they experienced. Butcher finally tracked down another witness from Times Square, a street performer who had been near the chaos. The man didn't remember seeing Aizen clearly, but he remembered feeling strangely calm when he looked at him. Butcher latched onto that detail, not the image, the emotional response, because unlike memories, emotions weren't shifting. This man made people feel calm, while everything else fell apart. That was a clue. Across the world, intelligence agencies reached the same grim conclusion. This phenomenon could not be fought through technology, force, or analysis. The more they looked, the more uncertain they became. The more uncertain they became, the less capable they were of responding coherently. The world was trying to resist, and failing without even realizing why. Homelander stood in the middle of an empty stadium at midnight, staring at the field lights. He whispered to himself, trying to anchor his thoughts. He repeated what he knew to be true: his name, his powers, his history. He clung to facts like lifelines. Then he asked himself a question he couldn't answer. When did this start? He realized he didn't know, and that terrified him more than anything. Aizen closed his book and stood from the library table. He walked out into the quiet night air, passing by people who barely registered his presence. He understood that the world was reaching the point he had anticipated. They were no longer asking who he was. They were asking what was happening to them. And once that question dominated their thoughts, control had already shifted. Because they were no longer reacting to him. They were reacting to the loss of certainty itself. Billy Butcher stopped chasing sightings. He stopped asking who had seen the man in white and where. Instead, he asked a different question every time he interviewed someone. How did you feel when you looked at him? The answers were disturbingly consistent. People described a strange calm, like the chaos around them had briefly quieted. They didn't remember his face, but they remembered the sensation of being observed by someone completely unafraid. Butcher realized that emotion was the only stable evidence left. Memories shifted, footage lied, descriptions contradicted themselves, but feelings didn't rewrite as easily, and every person who had been near Aizen described the same unsettling stillness, like they had been standing near the eye of a storm without realizing it. That was when Butcher understood the pattern. This man wasn't causing panic directly. He was creating calm in the middle of panic, and that calm made people trust their own perception long enough for it to be quietly replaced. At Vought, Starlight reached a similar conclusion from the opposite direction. She reviewed reports from supes who had encountered Aizen and noticed they all described him as polite, soft-spoken, and reasonable. No aggression. No threats. He didn't behave like an enemy. He behaved like someone who belonged there. That subtle normalcy was what allowed him to pass through their defenses unnoticed. He wasn't hiding. He was being accepted. Homelander, meanwhile, grew increasingly unstable in his attempts to regain control. He returned to the rooftop where he had last spoken to Aizen and stood there for hours, waiting. He believed if he stayed long enough, the man would reappear. But time passed with nothing happening, and the silence began to feel like mockery. He screamed into the night sky, demanding Aizen show himself. No one answered. Aizen watched from several buildings away, unseen and unhurried. He observed Homelander's desperation with mild curiosity. The strongest being in this world was trying to solve the problem by waiting for a visual confirmation that could never be trusted. It was a predictable reaction, and that predictability made it ineffective. Aizen did not need to confront him again. Homelander was already fighting himself. Butcher gathered Frenchie and Mother's milk in the safe house and laid out his theory. This wasn't about sight. It wasn't even about perception in the normal sense. This was about authority over perception. Someone else was deciding what people believed they had experienced, and that control was so subtle that most didn't realize it had happened until it was too late. They weren't being fooled. They were being guided. Butcher concluded that chasing Aizen physically was useless. They had to find a way to understand the mechanism behind what he was doing, because if they couldn't, the world would keep unraveling without any direct confrontation ever happening. Across the city, emergency services began reporting a new development. People were calling in, claiming they had seen the man in white in places where he had never been. Entire neighborhoods reported sightings simultaneously. Some swore he had walked past them calmly. Others insisted he had spoken to them. None of the accounts aligned, and none could be verified. The idea of Aizen had begun to move independently of his physical location. That realization terrified Vought more than anything else. Ashley listened to reports and felt the dread settle in. They were no longer tracking a person. They were tracking the concept of him. Starlight proposed something radical during a meeting. She suggested that maybe the only way to resist was to stop trying to verify anything visually at all, to accept that sight was compromised and focus on consistency of thought instead. It sounded abstract, but it was the first idea that didn't involve more surveillance. No one knew how to implement it. Homelander finally admitted something out loud to himself. He might have been under this influence before Times Square. He couldn't pinpoint when the first doubt had entered his mind. That meant the encounter in the street wasn't the beginning. It was just the first time he had noticed. And that meant Aizen had been ahead of him from the start. Aizen stood on a quiet rooftop at dawn, watching the city slowly wake. He understood that Butcher was close to grasping the shape of the problem, even if he didn't know the name Kyoka Suijitsu. But understanding the pattern did not grant immunity. Knowledge did not undo what had already been seen. The blade had been released. The world was now operating inside its influence. And the most dangerous part was that no one realized there was no way back to before. The first institution to fail publicly was the police. 2 precincts in Manhattan responded to the same emergency call from opposite directions. Both units arrived within seconds of each other and immediately began arguing over what they were seeing. One group insisted a man was standing calmly in the middle of the street. The other swore the road was empty. Bodycams recorded nothing unusual, yet the officers' voices grew increasingly agitated as they accused each other of incompetence. The confrontation ended with weapons drawn between officers who were supposed to be on the same side. The footage went viral before Vought or the government could contain it. People watched in horror as trained professionals argued over a reality they were sharing in real time. It was no longer about supes or riots. It was about authority figures losing the ability to agree on what existed in front of them. Trust cracked instantly. Courts followed next. A high-profile trial in New York was delayed when multiple jurors insisted a man had entered the courtroom and spoken to the defendant. Security footage showed no such event. The judge ordered a recess, then quietly dismissed the jury when they refused to agree on what had happened. Legal proceedings across the city began stalling as testimonies became unreliable. Evidence meant nothing if perception could not be trusted. Hospitals reported patients describing visitors who never appeared on sign-in logs. Schools received calls from parents claiming teachers had vanished mid-lesson. Transportation services logged reports of drivers swerving to avoid pedestrians no one else could see. The pattern was no longer subtle. The city was operating on fractured realities. Billy Butcher watched the reports pile up and understood the scale. This wasn't chaos from panic anymore. This was structural collapse. Systems built on shared perception were breaking because that shared perception no longer existed. And there was no enemy to point at, no explosion to contain. Just doubt spreading quietly through every interaction. Vought attempted to step in with public reassurances. They released statements claiming investigations were underway, promising clarity soon. But their words rang hollow in a world where clarity had lost meaning. Social media filled with people accusing Vought of hiding something far worse than they admitted. For the first time, Vought's authority over narrative was gone. Homelander watched the news in silence. He didn't feel anger. He felt a growing understanding that this man had done something he could never undo through force. Homelander could break cities with strength, but this was different. This was a dismantling of the invisible agreements that allowed society to function. And he had no way to punch that. Starlight began refusing to go on patrol. She told Vought she would do more harm than good. If she encountered someone she couldn't verify, her reaction might escalate things further. The realization that sups themselves could no longer operate safely in public was the final blow to Vought's confidence. Their heroes were now liabilities. Aizen walked through a crowded subway station during rush hour, hands behind his back, watching commuters rush past. No one stopped him. A woman briefly glanced at him and then shook her head as if clearing a thought. A man stepped aside to avoid bumping into him without realizing why. He moved through the crowd like a quiet current, subtly influencing without ever touching. He did not feel triumph. He felt confirmation. This world had relied on shared reality as an unspoken foundation. By removing that foundation, he had turned every system fragile without needing to break anything directly. Butcher gathered his team and said something that changed their approach entirely. "We're not trying to stop him," he said. "We're trying to survive what he's already done." That shift in thinking was the first honest reaction anyone had voiced. Governments held emergency summits over secure channels, trying to coordinate a response. But the calls were filled with disagreements over basic reports. Leaders questioned whether their own intelligence was accurate. Advisors hesitated to trust visual data. Meetings ended without decisions because no one could agree on what information was reliable. Global cooperation began to fracture. Homelander finally left Vought Tower again, not to search for Aizen, but to observe the city. He flew slowly over streets where arguments broke out over nothing. He saw officers hesitating before entering buildings. He saw civilians filming everything and trusting nothing. For the first time, he understood the scale of what had been done. This was not an attack. This was a removal. Aizen stood on a rooftop, as dawn painted the skyline in muted light. He understood that the next stage was inevitable. Once institutions lost trust in perception, they would begin relying on something else, something more aggressive, more forceful, because when people cannot trust what they see, they fall back on control through power. And that shift was already beginning. the first official order, did not mention Aizen by name. It simply authorized the use of force in situations where perception could not be verified. Police, military, and federal units were instructed to act decisively rather than hesitate. If something could not be confirmed, they were to assume threat instead of uncertainty. It was a quiet shift in policy with devastating consequences. Within hours, reports came in of officers tackling civilians who had done nothing, convinced they were preventing something they could not explain. Soldiers fired warning shots at empty streets because they believed someone was standing there. Every action was justified by the same reasoning. Better to act than to doubt. Billy Butcher watched this unfold and muttered that the world had just made the worst possible decision. They had replaced uncertainty with aggression. And aggression, unlike doubt, caused real damage. Vought tried to distance itself publicly from the new policies, but privately they supported them. If perception could not be trusted, then decisive action was the only way to maintain order. Ashley approved statements that sounded reassuring while knowing they would not fix anything. Starlight refused to participate. She saw what was happening for what it was. People were no longer trying to understand the phenomenon. They were trying to overpower it through force. And that meant innocent people would suffer because someone thought they saw something that wasn't there. Homelander watched soldiers push civilians to the ground and felt an unfamiliar sensation. Guilt. Because this was happening because of his confrontation with Aizen. The world had seen him lose control, and now they were following his example, acting first, questioning later. Aizen observed the shift with quiet interest from a balcony overlooking a tense street. He had not instructed anyone to use force. He had not encouraged panic. Yet the loss of certainty had driven the world to a predictable conclusion. When people cannot trust what they see, they stop trying to verify and start trying to dominate. This was human nature correcting for uncertainty. And it was far more destructive than anything he could have done directly. That afternoon, a military convoy rolled through a neighborhood after reports of unverified individuals appearing in multiple places at once. Soldiers moved cautiously, weapons raised. Civilians shouted in confusion as they were ordered inside their homes. One soldier suddenly fired at a parked car, convinced someone had ducked behind it. The bullet shattered glass and injured a bystander. The justification came quickly. He thought he saw someone. Butcher watched the footage and realized the world had entered a new phase. This was no longer about perception breaking down. This was about fear dictating action, and fear was contagious. Each incident created more panic, more distrust, more readiness to act without confirmation. The phenomenon was now feeding itself. Vought's internal reports showed a surge in violent encounters across the city, none of which could be traced back to an actual threat. They were reacting to ghosts created by unreliable perception. Ashley began to understand that the situation was spiraling, beyond any possibility of recovery. They had lost control of the narrative, and now the world was writing its own. Homelander flew low over a street, where soldiers were shouting orders at confused pedestrians. He hovered silently, watching the chaos he had helped trigger. For the first time, he didn't feel like a hero or a god. He felt like a witness to something he could not stop. He looked around, half expecting Aizen to be nearby, calmly observing. Aizen was, in fact, only a few blocks away, walking through a quiet side street. He did not need to be present at every incident. The chain reaction was already in motion. The world had chosen force over certainty, and that choice would do more damage than any illusion ever could. As evening fell, curfews were announced across Manhattan. People were ordered indoors, told to avoid unnecessary travel, told to remain calm. But calm had become impossible in a city where neighbors argued over what they were seeing. Billy Butcher realized something grim. Aizen no longer needed to do anything. The world was destroying its own stability in an attempt to fight a problem it didn't understand. And that was exactly what Aizen wanted. The first fatal incident between civilians happened just after midnight. Two neighbors in an apartment building argued in the hallway over a man they both claimed was standing between them. One insisted he was there, calm and silent. The other swore the hallway was empty. Voices rose. Accusations turned personal. One shoved the other. A fall down the stairs ended the argument permanently. Police arrived to find no third person present. The report listed the cause as a domestic dispute, but everyone involved knew it was. It was another fracture point where perception had failed and fear had taken over. And this time, someone had died because of it. The news spread quickly. People began realizing the danger was no longer theoretical. This wasn't about confusion or debate anymore. It was about real harm caused by an inability to agree on what was real. Billy Butcher watched the report and understood the meaning immediately. This was the point where society stopped trying to solve the problem and started trying to survive it. When survival instincts take over, reason becomes secondary, and that shift was irreversible. Vought's internal channels were filled with frantic discussions about liability. They weren't asking how to fix the problem anymore. They were asking how to avoid being blamed for it. Lawyers debated language while executives stared at data that made no sense. The company built on controlling perception had become powerless in a world where perception itself was broken. Starlight sat alone in a dark room, refusing to look at any screens. She had begun to distrust her own memory of simple things. She felt the creeping uncertainty settling into her thoughts, and she realized something terrifying. This wasn't something you could step outside of. It was already part of how you experienced the world now. There was no return to before. Homelander finally admitted what he had been avoiding. He was afraid. Not of Aizen's power, but of what that power had done. He had always believed strength solved problems, that if he could see it, he could stop it. But now he couldn't even trust what he was seeing. And that made him helpless in a way he had never felt before. Aizen stood on a quiet rooftop, overlooking a city that no longer felt stable. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply observed the natural progression of events. The world had reached the stage he had anticipated from the beginning. People were no longer reacting to him. They were reacting to the consequences of unreliable perception. And those consequences were now irreversible. Military command centers across the country began issuing a new type of order. Units were told to operate with minimal engagement, avoid contact unless absolutely necessary, retreat instead of investigate. The goal was no longer to confront the anomaly, but to minimize exposure to it. They were learning too late, because exposure had already happened. Butcher gathered his team and spoke quietly. "We're past stopping this," he said. "Now we figure out what happens next." It was the first time he had spoken without anger or sarcasm, just a cold acceptance that the world had crossed a line it could not step back over. Across Manhattan, people locked their doors earlier than usual. Neighbors stopped talking in hallways. Conversations became shorter, more cautious. Everyone moved through the city like they were walking across thin ice, afraid that any interaction might reveal another fracture in reality. Trust was evaporating at a personal level. Aizen looked out over the skyline as dawn began to break. He understood that the final stage was approaching, not because of anything he planned to do, but because of what the world would do in response to what had already happened. When certainty disappears, people look for something absolute to replace it. And that search was about to begin. The announcement did not come from Vought. It came from the government. a nationwide address advising citizens to limit exposure to visual media, avoid unnecessary travel, and report any perceptual inconsistencies immediately. The message was calm, measured, and carefully worded, but the implication beneath it was unmistakable. Reality could no longer be assumed. People listened in silence from living rooms, offices, and darkened apartments. Some nodded along. Others felt a slow dread settle in, because hearing it said out loud confirmed what they had already begun to suspect. This was not temporary. Billy Butcher watched the address without reacting. He had reached the point where confirmation no longer mattered. He understood the situation in a way most people didn't yet grasp. This wasn't a crisis that would pass. This was a permanent change in how the world functioned. From now on, every memory would carry doubt. Vought Tower was quieter than it had ever been. Executives no longer argued about solutions. They spoke in low voices about containment, adaptation, liability. Their entire business model had depended on spectacle and visual narrative. Now, visual narrative was meaningless. The empire built on perception had nothing left to stand on. Starlight stepped outside for the first time in days and walked through the streets. People moved carefully, avoiding eye contact, avoiding long conversations. No one shouted anymore. No one rioted. The chaos had burned out, replaced by something colder and far more unsettling. Cautious acceptance. Homelander stood on the roof of Vought Tower, staring out over the city. He had stopped looking for Aizen. He had stopped trying to understand what had happened. He had reached the same conclusion as everyone else, though he would never say it out loud. He had lost. Not in a fight, but in a way he could never correct. Aizen walked through Manhattan one last time, as the sun rose fully over the skyline. He passed people who did not notice him, who barely registered anything around them anymore. He observed the stillness that had replaced the panic. This was the final state he had anticipated. A world that no longer trusted what it saw. He did not feel the need to stay. His purpose here had been fulfilled the moment certainty collapsed. There was nothing more to dismantle. The system had already unraveled itself trying to compensate for what he had done. Billy Butcher sat in the safe house, staring at a blank wall. He realized something with quiet clarity. They would never catch this man. They would never undo what he had done. The best they could hope for was learning to live in a world where evidence meant less than instinct. And that was a world no one had prepared for. Across the city, people adapted. They relied more on routine, on habit, on small certainties they could control. They stopped arguing over what they had seen. They stopped trying to prove anything. Conversations became simpler, quieter, less confident. Society had not collapsed. It had changed shape. Aizen paused on a bridge overlooking the river as morning traffic began to flow again. He looked out at the city one final time, hands behind his back, expression calm as ever. This world had tried to build control through image, narrative, and spectacle. He had simply shown them how fragile that control truly was. And now they would live with that knowledge forever. Because no matter how much time passed, no one would ever fully trust their own eyes again. The world had not been destroyed. It had been altered. Irreversibly.